Welcome, everyone. How are we doing today? It's a good day, isn't it?
It's a lovely day.
Lovely day, Martin. All right, we have a great speaker today. My name is Peter Mongeau, and I'm president of the Wellesley Historical Society Board of Directors. I have to read the introduction because I have to thank all the good people. So I don't want to forget anyone. So the speaker series is made possible by our generous sponsor, Christine Meyer, and is presented in partnership with the Wellesley Free Library. Our speaker today is Christoph Strobel. He's department chair and professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Most recently, he's the author of War and Colonization in the Early American Northeast, also Native Americans of New England and the Global Atlantic. He has published many other books and academic papers. Could you please welcome Professor Strobel?
Well, thank you so much for the nice introduction. And yeah, we're going to have a crash course in history today, talking about 16, 17,000 years of history in about 45 minutes. Easy peasy. I think what I'm going to do is maybe if some emerging question like really burns you, just raise your hand and we'll stop things and I'll try to catch up. But I will also leave ample time at the end to answer your questions. Is my voice projecting enough? Okay. So what we're trying to do today is study a lot of history, but what we're also looking at is what I call colonial legacies. So I'm not Native American, I should say at the outset. I'm complete opposite. Fresh off the boat is, I think, what they call it in certain circles. And most of my work sort of deal more with issues of colonization and sort of the impact of mainstream society and how indigenous depictions or how indigenous people are represented by mainstream society, and which is, for example, the book project I'm working on right now. So I want to talk a little bit about the colonial legacies, but also emphasize that despite the fact that the history we're going to talk about today is often quite depressing, there's also the story of indigenous survival that is going on. And I think that's an important part of history to tell, just because it's a history that's often not being taught. It's started to being taught, but it's a perspective that a lot of people don't have. And I'm not here to preach or say, whoa, 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 you should know this, but I'm here to educate. And this is why I volunteer my time and talk to libraries and other public audiences. And I enjoy doing it. So if there's something that you viscerally disagree with, raise your hand. And I'm happy to address any issues that come up. I want to start out with sort of the major colonial legacy, but it's just one of many, and that is our state seal. Our state seal, our contemporary state seal, comes right out of the 1890s. But we've had sort of an earlier, and this is Massachusetts Bay Colony seal, that comes from the 17th century. It kind of gives the depiction of the Native American as naked. Usually my students, when I reference the Chiquita Banana Girl, they have no reference point, but usually at library talks, it's still a joke that works. And then, of course, come over and help us. What the help was is kind of, anyway. Try not to be preachy. But this is sort of the seal. My students always get a chuckle out of this, and it really helps them to sort of understand the 17th century mindset. Now, mindset of people doesn't necessarily mean historical realities, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But we have now the new seal, And you probably noticed the difference. Hey, the dude's dressed. Awesome. We still have the bow and arrow still pointing downwards. By the way, that bow, the original, is at the Harvard Museum, taken away from a Native American killed outside of Sudbury in the 1650s. We've got King Philip's belt. Woo, very cool. More on that later. And the body of the Native American is based on a skeleton that was found on Winthrop Island, or like Winthrop on the island, not the island, but it's in Winthrop, Massachusetts. This is the late 19th century. There were indigenous people in Massachusetts, but we had just closed down their reservations, or what they called reserves then. More on that later. And people thought, they just don't look Native American enough. I spent a lot of time in the 90s on the Seneca Reservation in Western New York, and they had like this, the X-Files came to, if you're like X-File nerds, the one about the white wolf on the Seneca, and then the production team just left. Man, these people don't look Native American enough. So they went out west and hired a bunch of actors out there. This is what the designer of this seal did as well. Just used a person from the western United States and imposed the head on that. Now, this irks some indigenous people, understandably, because we kind of have this Frankenstein guy, head, severed head. Then we have the sword on top, right? Woo-hoo! The first encounter between Massachusetts Native Americans and the Plymouth colonists, granted the Wampanoags kind of probably manipulated them a little bit to like strike the Massachusetts, who they were not in the most friendliest relation, ended up with some of the Massachusetts getting decapitated. And one of their leaders was piped outside of Plymouth Plantation for a while. Now, this seems mean to us today, but this was general British warfare at the time. And there's warfare and violence on both sides in the conflicts. But having sort of the head, the body, and the sword is just not necessarily the best thing to have on our Massachusetts seal. There has been sort of a campaign to get rid of the seal. There has been even a commission put in place, but I work in academia, and when you like want to kill things, you just put a committee in charge of it. I think the same thing works in Congress too, right? I might be wrong there. But so I would have said 4 years ago, yeah, we'll probably get something different at some point. But who knows? But so that's the kind of history of the visible colonial legacies that we also don't really think about. And I don't necessarily think, if you like the state seal, I think seals are, like, make horrible flags, but that's my personal aesthetical assumption. Plus, I don't like the history. I'm cool with that, but it's my job as an educator to tell people, well, that's it. But this is just one of many examples of how indigenous representation works in New England. There's many more. We have sort of, looking at the Grants, American writers from Bradford to Cotton Mather to Thoreau to Whittier. They all, in their work, present sort of these intellectual legacies about myths about Native Americans. How this land was a wilderness, virgin land, settled by nomads. But really, when we look at the history of North America and of New England, which arguably my archaeologist friends always refer to as New England as the backwater. So yes, New England didn't have the large cities that you had in the Midwest, the South, or out west, or even Tenochtitlan, the Aztec so-called empire, which was maybe somewhere between 100 to 250,000 people strong. The largest Spanish city at the time, Seville, about 30,000 people. So we often tend to think of like Native American backwardness, but this was a continent just like Europe of cities, long distance exchange networks. New England was a major contributor of coastal shells in these exchanges. We have over 10 millennia of history. There was agriculture, there was social complexity in New England as in other parts of North America, and Native Americans managed the landscape through controlled forest fires, et cetera, to create ways of making hunting easier. Now, the reason why Native Americans hunted is so they could bring meat in their diet, because there were no beasts of burden in the Northeast. Even the turkey, the variety we eat today, is from Mexico and the Southwest. So even our turkeys wouldn't let themselves be domesticated. Everyone that has some in their backyard probably knows they're vicious little brutes. All right, so this is kind of the long history here of social complexity and how it sort of stacks up culturally. For like 400 years, we've had these representations that kind of crash against reality. Of course, this all comes out of a pretty sad, violent history. And there's some good, but there's also a lot of bad and ugly in that history, right? Remember the absence of domestic animals. This was a big issue for indigenous people when people of European descent came over, African descent, Asian descent, because they got a whole slew of disease that they had not been exposed to prior to the coming of European and other groups. And so in New England, but in other parts of North America, there's a lot of people dying of all kinds of diseases. Now, the way historians in the 1980s is like, oh, disease wiped out all Native Americans. It's partially true, but there's also a lot of violence, warfare, and slave raiding that helps along in the process. So we in Massachusetts like to pride ourselves the first. I work up in Lowell, lived in Lowell, first to die in the Civil War, first birthplace of Industrial Revolution. People in Waltham are like, what? But there's always, we like to be the first. Even on slavery, we kind of are the first, at least in North America amongst the English-speaking colonies. How did it work? Guys heard of the Pequot War? Yeah, so it's this brutal conflict in the 1630s. There's this massive massacre of indigenous people at the Mystic Fort. Even sort of like the apologists of Puritans, like the recent generation, Alden Vaughan, he's kind of said, yeah, that war was really sleazy. And it kind of is. But in the aftermath of this war, the Puritan colonists brought a lot of war captives into the colony. And you see sort of the elite among the Puritans, Winthrop and many others, they're kind of debating, well, we've got these war captives. Well, didn't the Romans call their war captives slaves? Ding, 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 ding. In 1644, Mass Bay Colony is the first North American English-speaking colony that puts like a system on the books that we today can read. And I'm like, that sounds a lot like slavery. And a lot of these Pequots were also exchanged for people of African descent, so you just sent them somewhere else. And voila, Massachusetts had a functioning system of slavery that consisted of a lot of Native Americans, and throughout the 17th century of a lot of African Americans. The African American population overgrew the Native American population. But of course, people also have sexual intercourse, so there's a lot of intermixing going on here. All right, so got disease, we got slavery, dispossession of land is kind of straightforward, right? Dismantling of community, the issue of race and colonization, all of these are like frequently told stories of history, at least for now. But what I also want to emphasize, there's a lot of resistance, but there's also a lot of indigenous adaptation. There's a lot of indigenous resilience, and indigenous people struggle to maintain their sovereignty. All right. I want to just go take a deep dive into one historic moment that very much underscores the complexity and the ugliness of a lot of this history, and that is King Philip's War. It's potentially the most violent American conflict if we look at casualties versus population. Now, I understand the colonial population was not very large, probably roughly in New England about 50,000 people. But in terms of like people dying, overall population, historians rank it as the most violent conflict. For indigenous people, it might have been as many as recently scholars have suggested 7 out of 10. I'm not sure how accurate these numbers are, but most scholars would argue at least 50% is the casualty rate. The way King Philip's War is often told is the colonists against Native Americans. Story is a lot more complicated. So you have the groups like the Pequot, like the Mohegans, they side with the colony. And in fact, probably Connecticut has far less casualties in the war compared to Rhode Island and Massachusetts because of their use of Native American allies. You have communities like in Natick, a Native American praying town. So these are Native American indigenous converts to Christianity. They serve on the side of the colony, sign up in very high numbers at the outset of King Philip's War. Increasingly, Massachusetts Bay colonists feel resentful towards Native Americans, and you have the Native Americans from that community put onto Deer Island in Boston Harbor, where they're pretty much interned on an island. They're not allowed to collect firewood, wood for construction. They're not necessarily supplied with food on a regular basis, so there's these accounts of how they're like going out when the water goes out, trying to find mussels and other food, fishing, to feed their families. So these soldiers that had initially fought for the colony are incarcerated. Another group from the Littleton area, the Neshawe or Neshoba praying town, they're put into Concord, are interned there, and then later put onto Deer Island. We don't know how many of these people perished on Deer Island. But we also know that by April, the indigenous people come back and fight on the side of the colonists. They also help in the negotiation of release of captives. So, for example, Anne Hutchinson, which some of you might have read. My students don't read this stuff anymore. When I was in college, I was still forced to read this stuff. The people that helped in her liberation were 2 people from the Native community that had been incarcerated. When they rejoin the war in April, they collect 400 indigenous scalps. They refuse to get paid for those scalps. Usually, as a soldier, if you brought in a scalp, or especially as a militia, or as like freebooting private soldiers, it's a career in colonial America. You could just get a bunch of guys together, go out during wartime, kill Native Americans, scalp them, and then get paid in Boston. Really good currency. At times it was like as much as 2 years' pay for a grunt soldier. So it's a lucrative business. Native Americans, of course, also scalped, right? And we know about that history, but what we often don't talk about is sort of the scalping. So when we hear about the story of people like Hannah Duston, the reason why she was so keen to scalp the seventh child ran away. An old man, 2 women, and 1 Native Americans of fighting age. Why she was so keen on scalping them is that they could collect money. At least if we're to trust Cotton Mather, who is the only source that we have on this particular case. But it's a very complex, violent history. But what is also important to emphasize, even at 50%, this does not mean that this was a war between Native Americans and colonists, but it was a war of Native Americans, colonists, and their Native American allies. What really breaks King Philip's resistance's neck is a Mohawk incursion into New England. King Philip asked the Mohawk for help, by the way, also done by the Pequots before, during the Pequot War. And as with the Pequot, it doesn't end well. King Philip got to keep his hands. The Pequot leaders didn't. But his army was very much challenged and attacked. And then the Mohawk proceeded to attack the colonies. Of course, the Mohawk were part of the League of Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, and they did not want a powerful alliance system to emerge in New England. So there was a little bit of beef on that side. By the way, what happened to King Philip, whose belt we see so nicely displayed here at the end of the war? Also gets his head chopped off. And they apparently left it piked outside of Plymouth for 2 decades. Weedamoo, his sister-in-law, who helps him actually escape from the American troops probably, also. And they pike her head outside of Taunton. So, taunting in Taunton. King Philip's wife and son are sold into slavery. And so are probably, definitely 1,000 Native Americans, but historians today estimate as many as 2,000 Native Americans. And again, out of a population of roughly 30,000 Native Americans in southern New England at the time of King Philip's War. The war was never, and this is an important thing to keep in mind in this history too, it's never just as easy for the English colonists as the history books are telling you, right? First off, Plymouth Plantation, right? We know that when the colonists arrived, they moved right on a town called Pawtucket. And we know about this because they moved right onto cleared farm fields. So all the work has been done. They realize it's a great harbor. We know that Champlain wrote about this Native American town, and that it was a major trade entrepot. We know that the Puritans themselves talk about Native American skulls being that they find them there. And we know that Native Americans in the Northeast bury their dead unless something really traumatic happens. So the disease outbreaks that already hit at the time are kind of an indication of the sort of trauma that Native Americans were undergoing. And the Wampanoag sought an alliance system with the English because they realized their numbers were shrinking, and they realized, trade goods, powerful military allies. But we also need to remember that when the Pilgrims, so-called, arrived, they got rebranded in the 18th century. About almost half of the 100 people that got off the boat died. And they were so scared that they buried their dead in the middle of the night because they knew they were being watched. And so this is our stories to sort of underscore how complex the situation is here and how interwoven this world is. Who, of course, helped the Pilgrims? Squanto, right? Ever wonder how Squanto learned such good English? Right? I mean, he was captured. John Smith, second in command of Pocahontas fame. That story's made up too, sorry. Didn't show up until third version of Smith's rendition of what happened in Virginia. Right after Pocahontas arrived with her actual husband, John Rolfe, at the court. After the visit, she died. So she couldn't set the record straight. Anyway, but there was a lot of raiding for people, captive taking. And Squanto was one of those unlucky people. And he was lucky in a sense that he made it back, right? But he's one of several hundred, probably thousands of people in the low thousands that were captured that way. We have accounts of French, Portuguese people, and taking captives with them. So this is a lot of depressing history. But for the remainder of the talk, I want to focus on the story of survival. Because the story is often told, King Philip's War, and then no more, the textbooks usually don't talk about Native Americans in southern New England anymore. And that story is also not accurate. So we have many indigenous reserves that survive into the late 19th, into the second half of the 19th century. Indigenous people live as slaves and indentured people. They continue to provide military service in all the wars of the late 17th and 18th century. Christianity is an important part in those communities. Ministers and teachers like Samson Occam and William Apis, they also advocate on indigenous rights. Native Americans work in factories. Betsy Guppy Chamberlain up in Lowell, there's potentially at least 2-3 more people that we know have indigenous connections working in the factories, which probably means there is way more. They work in the agricultural sector. They work as domestic labor. There's a very active community of what is called, quote unquote, Indian peddlers, Indian doctors, and Indian performers. A lot of poor people, instead of going to the doctor, they went to Native American healers. Meant less cutting and bloodletting, and your survival chances were probably as bad or as good as going to a professionally trained medical person. And maybe their health, their plant-based medicines actually did more. And they're often then dressed up in these really crazy 19th century Great Plains outfits because they needed to be recognized as Native American. Because again, there's a lot of intermixing going on between African Americans, poor whites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Native Americans work in construction, logging industry in northern New England, river driving, which is getting the logs down the river, tourism trades around Bar Harbor. There's a lot of Native American artists selling their wares to tourists. And of course, the Penobscot community and canoe making are just several industries in which Native American work. And whaling in the 18th and 19th century, I mean, this is what today oil or gas is as an industry. So it's a very important industry. And a lot of whales are getting killed. Sorry, it's depressing, right? Sorry. So, a few things happen in the 19th century, which explain why there was a model from out west put on the face of the indigenous person on our state seal. So there's a lot of intermarriage that is going on. And the intermarriage often happens that poor whites, African Americans, intermarry with indigenous women. They stay on the community. Their children are raised in the community. And for all intents and purposes, they're kind of considered immigrant foreigners that have just married into the community, and their children are perceived as members of the community. But in mainstream society, what you often hear is sort of talks about like, well, this used to be a proud race of King Philip. It's funny how like the people you used to like fight in wars and come back, and you can sort of celebrate them all of a sudden. But now they're just through all this, and this again, 19th century scientific racism, where there's a lot of talk about blood quantum. Their blood has become so thin that they're not really indigenous people anymore, but they're often referred to in the documents as persons or people of color. Kind of funny how that used to be like sort of the hip thing to call people in the early 2000s, and it's right there in the 19th century. Anyway, so there's a lot of racism. And there's increasing pressure on indigenous hamlets, smaller communities. I mean, Thoreau, or Thorough as he liked to call himself, lived not that far away from a community of color where people of African and Native American descent were living very close by. And some of the characters in his Walden book are traced back to those communities. So you've had a lot of these smallish places, but by the second half of the 19th century, it's really just a couple of remaining reserves in which Native Americans exist. It's a very complicated story that would like fill its own talk, but I'm trying to sort of stick to 40 minutes so we have time for questions. What is happening is basically that the state governments are saying, we're going to close down these reserves, going to give every Native American a parcel of land, and whatever land is left over, we take on, they become voting citizens, and it's going to be good. Most indigenous people in New England hate that solution. There's one group, the Niantic, and they're saying, you can sell our reservation, that's fine, give us the proceeds. But they hadn't moved in with the Narragansett, so. But that's the only group that is in favor of this. And they're fighting this tooth and nail. But the state governments go ahead, and between 1860 and 1880, with the exception of a few reserves, most of them are sold off. And the tribes are disbanded. This is, again, under protest of indigenous people. Also, a lot of people lived in the cities at this point, too. This, of course, doesn't mean that these indigenous communities stopped existing, right? They still went to church. It's just that on their cross hang a feather. They still organized around their local ministers, who were civil rights advocates as well. They had community members, for example, among the Mohegans, Gladys Tantaquidgeon. Her and her family collected everything they could get on Mohegan histories that they could hang on. If you go to the Mohegan Reservation today, the Tantaquidgeon Museum, you find a lot of the artifacts that they collected. Native Americans fought this decision in the courts. They said, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, you have no right to take away our citizenship. We have this thing called the federal prerogative. Only the federal government can take away our rights of existence. And this went to the courts, and it was a very potent and powerful argument. However, judges decided to side with the state governments, who made the argument, well, you know what, guys? Like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, we existed before the United States. So we should be given a colonial precedent. And therefore, constitutionally understandings and legal understandings should not apply to us because our situation is different. And this is used all over the eastern seaboard to take indigenous rights away. So Gladys and her family collect. People keep going back to courts. You have a Penobscot amateur scholar, Joseph Nicolai, and I don't call him an amateur scholar like as a derogatory thing. He just had a real job and did his work on top of other things. The stuff he writes, the cultural history he writes about the Penobscot people, is a very interesting rate. I mean, professional anthropologists get to that level of cultural analysis in the 1960s and 1970s. So he's a man very much ahead of his time. And the point why I'm picking on Gladys and Joseph is these are just two people among many people that are trying to keep their communities together, and they're fighting tooth and nail against the powerful outsiders. And you have those in many communities all over New England. Remember the colonial precedent that said, well, Massachusetts and all the other eastern seaboard colonies need to be understood under legal. So again and again, this goes back to the courts. Again and again, Native Americans lose until the Tuscaroras, who used to be in North Carolina, but then become the Sixth Nation of the Iroquois, and then are for siding with the Americans during the Revolution, along with the Oneida Indians, one of the first groups that is removed out west. They take this to court, and it dawns on a judge, and he starts asking questions. So this means like Massachusetts, Connecticut, or New York in this case, could have all kinds of laws that are in violation of the Constitution because of the colonial precedent, and he shuts the whole thing down. And from this day on, the colonial precedent theory is dead as a legal doctrine, but who knows? We got all kinds of legal doctrines coming back, so we'll see. So this leads to a lot of state and federal recognition of various indigenous groups. Tantaquidgeon's family gives their corpus to the Mohegan Nation, and they use that. The Pequot, Mashpee Wampanoag, the Aquinnah on Martha's Vineyard, and many other Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet. The Nipmuc get state recognition. So this is one thing that happens in especially the late 70s, but really in the 1980s and moving forward. There's continued indigenous nationalism for like over 60 years now. Every Thanksgiving, there is a protest down in Plymouth on the Hill commemorating the other side of Thanksgiving. By the way, I had my first Thanksgiving spent on a Native American reservation. So, I mean, it's a very not contentious issue, but there's all kinds. There's a lot of economic and cultural revitalization. The Wampanoag Language Project, for example. The Penobscot up in rural Maine, like other communities in rural Maine, are fighting hard to keep the economies of their communities vibrant, which is a challenge in rural America. Language preservation, we already talked about it. Environmental issues. All of these issues are things that Native Americans struggle over to this day. So I want to leave it at that. I left the boarding school and family separation out just because I feel like I've depressed you enough. And if you want to learn more on that, I would suggest there's a documentary filmmakers called Dawnland, a documentary. I'm sure your library, if they don't have a copy, you can probably get it through the library exchange. And I'm happy to take questions. How about we start here, there next, there, and then the gentleman in the back. Yes?
I just wondered if you could explain a little more about the cultural precedence argument that you talked about. Which side did it favor? Why? I can see why it was abandoned if it didn't favor the.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
But-
Okay, I will. So the question is about the cultural precedent. I should premise, I'm not a lawyer. And what you find when you study a lot of Native American history, there's a lot of, and I think that's why having done a lot of focus on legal indigenous colonization history and taken quite a few classes on the subject matter, is just a realization, as one of my former lawyer friends calls it, the law is the ass. The law does a lot of things that powerful people want it to do. And I think we're living in a time now where we might experience this again. So in a sense, it was a convenient legal narrative that legal judges seemed to support, and it became a precedent that was argued again, until some judge was like, okay, I don't like the implications of this, and he threw it out. And that has been the story since then. But the federal government has a lot of power, and the federal government can create laws to sort of counteract these things. And this has happened in the 1880s and 1890s when it came to, for example, like land resource rights, right? In Indian Territory in Oklahoma, all of a sudden there's a lot of gas, and the federal government says, well, yeah, Native Americans own the land, but only 3 inches down. And that's a law passed by the Congress. Now, does this make sense to me? Absolutely, because it's rich people writing, and you have W.C. Duncan, the leader of the Cherokee Confederacy, like talking to the president, and while he has to wait for hours on end, you have special interest firms walking in and out of the president's office. And he will teach this sometime probably next week, but the quote is not in my head. But here is a guy, very eloquent, that clearly understands that what is happening to the Cherokee Nation or other indigenous communities in Oklahoma is very bad. And he uses a lot of like late 19th century management term, like the equivalent of today's branding, and so on. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
You referenced at the very end there about environmental issues. Can you give me an example of how the Native Americans were involved in those?
So there's, for example, water rights with the Penobscot Nation. The Penobscots pull a lot of fish out of the river and still sustain themselves through eating fish. But you have a lot of businesses around that put a lot of pollution in the river. And the quality of the fish, as both the Penobscot but also amateur fishermen who like to fish and eat healthy fish will attest to it. So you had an interesting alliance of environmentalists, hobby fishermen, Penobscot, and business interests that were fighting in the courts. And it's really like asinine legal, pardon my French, asinine legal discussions of like, does the river go into the sand, or does it stop at the end of the water? And this is what's being debated in the court. All I'm like, well, if we let the pipe drop into, is it considered pollution, or if we pump it in from underneath? And it's kind of like stuff that is, the Penobscot won that case, but it's the law, and who knows when the counter arguments will fly in. You were next, and then the gentleman in the back.
Well, I'm just curious. This touches on what she asked earlier, but regarding precedent, did anybody anywhere along the line say, well, you're talking about precedents, before there was Massachusetts, before there was, and we were here.
Maybe a few that were like cried out as crazy. Yeah. And we also have to remember there's these very strong narratives, right? And these are like people like Whittier, who's like proactive on abolishing slavery, right? But you like read his poetry, which is really bad on Native Americans. Whittier's probably personally fine, but his stuff on Native Americans, you're like, wow. And it's like all like the naked, catching the deer by hand kind of rhetoric. And so it's so ingrained in our culture, and that's why I always tell my students, I'm not blaming you for this, but I'm just providing you with a different narrative and a different perspective. I grew up in Germany, and so I had to like face that Nazi past all the time. And sort of the way, as a culture, there was more discussion, openness. It's not perfect, and there is a lot in Germany when it comes to like its colonial wars in Namibia. There's now conversation happening now. But there was at least sort of open discussion. My dad threw me out of the house in the 1980s because I was like, yeah, I mean, I like my granddad too, but, and then his wife's father was hung by the Nazis because he was a social democrat, and your great-grandfather, his friend was put in a concentration camp. So you get it from all sides, and this is a complex history, and so I just like to put light on it. Maybe it's unpatriotic, but I don't think so. I think coming in terms with the past, it's the sins of you 400 years ago in some instances. You're not personally responsible for this. But are there ways that we can make it better? Yes, sir.
Relative to the wilderness misconception that you had early on, what's the best figure on indigenous population in North America before the white invasion?
Okay, so for New England, it's probably somewhere between 100 to 150,000. All over North America, probably 10 to 13 million. But this is where I like to quote Winston Churchill, unless it's like a fake internet meme and I just picked it up. And it's all made up by AI. Don't trust a statistic that you haven't forged yourself, right? But what we also need to keep in mind is the English population wasn't that large either. So we're talking about like a global population of like 500 million. And we've only seen a population grow from roughly like 700 million, 800 million at the outset of the 18th century to wherever we are now, 8 billion, right? So we've seen a lot of growth in the last 200 plus years, and I think we're realizing it's causing a lot of problems, and therefore looking at earlier models of history, land management, land use, and sustainable living. That's why this past is also important. So there's also a selfish reason why we should study this stuff. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Yes?
And sometimes when you study these disenfranchised groups, there were mainstream allies who stepped up and spoke for them.
Yep.
And I don't know a lot that did this for the Native Americans in the course of the history or...
There always are. I'm
Can you repeat
trying.
the question? Can you repeat the question?
Oh, whenever groups of people get disenfranchised or disenfranchised groups of people, there is European or white allies, European American allies. Yeah, there are. And I mean, in the 19th century, the reason why the Seneca are removed is their white neighbors act up. And they're successful. You look at the Ponca or Pawnee in Nebraska, same thing happens. They're getting forcefully removed to Oklahoma anyway. And so, yeah, there is constant history, and just as today, people are trying to figure out ways of reconciliation and so on. And so, yeah, it's a factor, but in the case of New England, it's a small minority that isn't sort of convinced of the mainstream narrative. I hope that kind of answers your question. Yes, sir.
Just as an addendum to her question, as you well know, when the Indian Removal Act was being debated in 1830, the Cherokees and their allied tribes were being sent out to Oklahoma. There was an intense debate in the House and the Senate, a very close vote on whether this was the right thing to do. And you talk about powerful allies, some of the most senior people in the Congress were opposed to the Indian Removal Act. And the other thing about that that's interesting is the further they were away from the frontiers, the more likely they were to oppose it.
Yep.
If they were on the frontiers where their friends and neighbors were being killed, they were more likely to favor getting rid of
Yep.
the Indians.
Yep.
And I think that's pretty instructive with respect to her
Yeah.
question.
I mean, David Crockett, which I'm sure you still remember the show, he was one of the biggest advocates against removal. And he was like, yeah, I've killed a lot of Native Americans in my life. Not the word he would have used. But this is just an unchristian and un-American thing to do. So you always have people that try to do the right thing. And sometimes just doing the right thing is half the battle. Yeah.
Where did the Indians come from? Given that the Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, so maybe it's the land bridge. Maybe it's boat migration. I mean, when I started when I started college, sort of 70s, early 80s, it was sort of the land bridge, and that was sort of what everyone said. Now there is questions that are being raised about if there might have been alternative ways. It's hard to prove this stuff because it's like so many years back, and so you can't find under the ice human bones to like prove or disprove whether the Bering Strait. Maybe there were people here before, people intermixed. I honestly don't know. Genetic analysis, but genetic analysis also helps you to trace ancestors, which then doesn't necessarily give you the most direct. Somehow people got here, and it might be the Bering Strait migration, and it might be multiple migrations too. But that is way out of my area of academic expertise. I think we had you next, and then I'll go to the next hand.
I also have a question on Zoom whenever you're...
Okay.
A different type of question. The role of casinos and the tribal's response to it.
Okay, casinos is another complex story, because like in the way of the acknowledgement, like in the sort of the federal recognition, I had some friends when I was in graduate school that were doing research for lawyers who were working for the casino lobby. And so people are always like, it's so tainted, and like, and then there, all the Native American tropes come out. And I can see that point, but then I'm also looking at Connecticut and the incredible revenue the state of Connecticut by endorsing and condoning, and then Deval Patrick, we need casinos here. And we have casinos now that are corporate owned, and I'm not sure how much of a cutback the Commonwealth of Massachusetts gets there. So like states like in California and in Connecticut, there have been very good arrangements. And full disclosure too, when I was on the Seneca Reservation, I was hanging out with all casino opponents. And I used to work like 3 weeks in a gambling hall, and I hated myself for it. And so I have biases there that I need to disclose. Should we go to the Zoom?
Sure. So I have a question from Liam Skelly from the Zoom. He asks, could you discuss the issues of land disputes between Weetamu and Peter Talman as a cause of KPW, and as well as Wamsuta's potential poisoning and potential land grab as a precursor of war?
That's your score
So
for the year.
this is all about Wampanoag, pre and King Philip, like the way up to King Philip's War. I want to put a plug in for a colleague of mine who's a Massachusetts native and now teaches at George Washington University. This land is their land, has a lot of information on that particular topic, and so I would refer to his work. I mean, these are things, was Wamsuter poisoned? Was he killed by Native Americans? I think these are sort of the conspiracy theories of the 17th century. And it's really hard to disprove or prove what actually happened on the existing evidence. And of course, on the land transaction piece, let me say this. Like every local history event I go to, people are always at length pointing out, well, we legally purchased this land from the Native Americans. And there's also needs to be a clear understanding that it's in the Pilgrims rebranded in the 18th century. They were a bunch of communists. I mean, I'm being flip here. But, I mean, they held the land in common. The minister gets 2 sections of land. The important people get 1.5 section. The more normal people get 1. The bad people get a half section of land. And that was how land was divvied up. And that's why we in Massachusetts communities have it common. And it's only in the 17th century that we have sort of notions of private property emerging. And John Locke, who's like the private property guy, is like defining it more clearly in the late 17th century. Incidentally, using Native American wild people wandering nakedly through the wilderness as sort of the argument why you need to have private property. By the way, John Locke had a lot of literature, like the anthropological literature of his day in his library, and he knew better. But it goes back to the Locke argument, right? I mean, the Cherokee removal is argued, and like the Supreme Court goes on and on and on, how these wandering Cherokees. I mean, the Cherokees have plantations. They own slaves. Enslaved people. But there's a reason why the cotton plantation owners want their land, because it's already clear. You don't have to go to a swamp in Alabama, drain it all, cut down the trees, and do that. And people were speculating. And I mean, if you want to learn more sort of on that history, I think, especially on the African American side, I think 12 Years a Slave does a very good job in giving a pretty accurate depiction, right? I mean, is it exactly what happened? No, it's a work of fiction, or it's like based on a true story kind of account. But it gives you a pretty nasty insight of what things were like at the time. Does this mean everyone was bad? No. Did it mean people were against removal or against slavery? Absolutely. Does it also mean that some of the people that were against removal and against slavery were also kind of a little bit racist? Absolutely too, right? I mean, we're all kind of fallible, right? And we try to like visualize life in good and bad guys. But there's a lot of ugly in between. And we all make choices in our lives where we kind of hold our nose. So, and that's not different from people in the 19th century. And it's easy to say, oh, didn't they know? I am sure future generations, when it comes to climate change, will ask that same question. And I would have to say, okay, so, yeah. There were more questions, I think. I think there was one in the back. Okay, so, all right. Sir, and there was another hand. Okay, yes. Oh, yes, no, sorry, here, yeah.
I mean, this is a completely different kind of question, but has all your research in this area gotten into the personal stories of intermarriage, actually, between whites and Native Americans, and some of those stories, and how did that go down in the Native American community, for example, or the other community? I mean, some of us here might have been DNA tested and discovered that we're 0.5% Native American.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, do you want to step up, sir? Is this actually, oh, why don't we do this? Sorry.
I can't remember what I just asked. Basically, it has to do with intermarriage between Native Americans and non-Native Americans, and how that went down in the Native American community, and how that went down. Just anecdotally, has there been a major study? I doubt it, but I'd just be curious. And I think probably some of us here have been DNA tested and discovered that we're 0.02% Native American, and for a reason, right?
Yeah, it's the American melting pot. Yeah, that's a good question. Personally, I think this is the kind of work that I leave to indigenous colleagues to do, because these like quote unquote tribal history or community history, they've got way smarter people and way better connected people than me. There is some work that's being done, and it's mixed. Just like, for example, among the Narragansett community, there was some critical voices raised about people, especially intermarrying with African American. In Virginia, the eastern seaboard tribes, so the descendant people of the Powhatan, in the late 19th century, there's a real racist history with segregation of pushing off people that had partial and visible African descent and get them off the tribal rolls. In the case of the Cherokee, it was only in fairly recent history that the group called the Cherokee Freedmen, so that had enslaved people in Cherokee community, that got full citizenship right and the right to vote in very recent years. So there is, racism, stereotypes, they go all kinds of ways and happen in very complex ways. And I think that's the best way, like giving 3 examples from across the spectrum that I can give. But then there's also people who are like, who cares? Yeah. Yes.
As a follow-up to Tom's question, I'm just curious, do you have any insight into the background of Crispus Attucks, one of the first victims of the Boston Massacre, who apparently was of multiple races himself?
Yeah. I don't know much about it. One of the women that was part of the Salem, sometimes she's described as Native American, sometimes it's described as African American, and I think it's really just our own hung upness on modern concepts of race. I don't think it mattered to people. People have sex, stuff happens, oops, and then, yeah. And so I think we have kind of these modern, like 19th century blood quantum understandings, right? And again, I'm kind of like looking at sort of like in the 1980s, like all these people were trying, in Germany, were trying to find like Jewish ancestors, right? And like, it's kind of like having Native American ancestors. Chances are, if you do a gene test, it shows up, right? And you can trace them back to the 19th century. That doesn't make you Jewish, right? It's like you've sort of grown up into this, and it becomes sort of like a shame and guilt thing. And maybe if I find a little bit of Native American, that means I'm not part of this. But I think that kind of misses the point of what we need to do as a country. This is not your personal shame and guilt. It's trying to create a system that is better and that's more equitable and fair. And yeah, there's that. They're going to put this up on the internet, so if I get deported, you know why. All right.
Well, thank you all for coming today. Professor will be hanging around.
So if you have questions.
Happy to answer. Just want to let everyone know our next event is our Spring Gala, and we have Rick Atkinson, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian there, and I think we have about 30 or 40 slots left, so hope you come to the gala, all right? Oh, the gala's May 8th. It's at the Wellesley Country Club, and we bring in a speaker every year, and this year we have Rick Atkinson. He wrote The Long Gray Line, the Great World War II trilogy. Now he's doing a trilogy on the Revolutionary War. So his book comes out on April 30th. He's speaking at our place on May 8th, and this is the second one of the Revolution trilogy, and we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and Rick Atkinson is our speaker. So come May 8th, it's a Thursday night, and you can go to our website and sign up for it, and we have cards right out there about the gala. But thank you all for coming.
Tom and I will be there.
Yes, I'm there.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.